Mark Twain's An Open Letter to the American People, published in the New York Weekly Review, February 17, 1866, provides a comic lesson in how not to write a personal letter. In it, he suggests that the writer of good newspaper correspondence must mimic a sense of intimacy that should occur in a private letter. After displaying poor examples, Mark Twain reveals his idea of a model letter written by a child who tells all she sees with vividness and intimacy. The same qualities of vividness, intimacy, and accurate detail on subjects that will interest a reader also create successful travel letters. Clemens applied this lesson to his own early travel writings about voyages to the Kingdom of Hawaii, to New York City from San Francisco, and to Europe and the Holy Land, all of which created his initial national reputation as Mark Twain. Sam Clemens began his ascent to that national fame working as a reporter and correspondent for the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise. As a contribution to the literary portrait of Nevada that provides background for Roughing It, my talk will briefly examine two other correspondents to discern similarities and differences. William Wright, who also worked for the Enterprise as a colleague of Sam Clemens, J.Ross Browne, who traveled to Virginia City to report on the beginning of the Comstock Silver Strike for Harper's Monthly. William Wright once recalled Clemens' reputation for, quote, giving, quote, cast iron items a lick and a promise, unquote, and characterized him as a reporter who, quote, hated to have to do with figures, measurements, and solid facts, end quote. Nevertheless, the material Clemens wrote as Mark Twain in the summer of 1863 for the San Francisco Call as its Washoe correspondent displays elements very similar to those found in the correspondence penned by Wright as Dandy Quill for the Golden Era during the late summer and fall of 1863. Neither Clemens nor Wright in their newspaper correspondence merely treat subjects with a lick and a promise, yet neither are they shy about making a point with a dramatic scene, nor about mixing in comic elements or projecting a comic personality. Striking similarities between the work of William Wright and Sam Clemens remain when one compares their out-of-town correspondence for periodicals other than home base, the Territorial Enterprise. However, when given the chance to write an extended series of travel letters on a newly discovered mining district for the influential Golden Era, Wright as Dandy Quill instead noticeably curbs his comic abilities. Wright's Washoe Rambles demonstrates in its accurate details on the subject of a silver strike east of the Comstock a keen repertorial skill, even though he was aware that his audience enjoyed a comic sketch well told under any circumstance. Wright certainly had boldly indulged that approach in the past. Possibly this turn toward a more serious account of the journey into a new mining district represents his more natural approach to the subject, or possibly a calculated decision about how to handle a big opportunity, his first chance to write a series of travel letters for a leading literary periodical. The series of 12 installments in the Golden Era without doubt solidified the reputation of William Wright, representing an initial plateau in his writing career. However one assesses the motivation for its style, Washoe Rambles reads as an excellent journalistic portrait of the Nevada Territory in the early days of its first big mining boom, rendered in straightforward prose, the very plainness of which creates a clear and vivid picture. William Wright's facility for unadorned but compelling narrative, so well displayed, for example, in the recounting of his impressions of the growth of Virginia City, is the source of his travel letters still considerable value. Sections of the various installments from the Golden Era read like letters from an informal, gentlemanly ethnographer, reporting to colleagues on the area north and west of the Carson Sink. Not only does Washoe Rambles present vivid portraits of individual Paiutes that Wright and his two companions met on their 20-day trek in the desert, but it also describes Paiute clothing, living conditions, diet, farming, and hunting habits, as well as noting emotional behaviors of individuals in specific circumstances. Wright as Dandy Quill even briefly records discussions about Paiute religious beliefs. Washoe Rambles at times also reads like the informal report of an amateur geologist, but this aspect occurs more infrequently than one might think, given Wright's legendary careful eye for types of rock and mineral. Though the expedition ostensibly centers on finding coal and quicksilver, a holiday feeling rather than hardcore prospecting effort characterizes the narrative. When detailed descriptions of terrain do appear, they invariably demonstrate Wright's credentials as a writer knowledgeable about mining. The detailed description of terrain also conveys the harshness of the country in which the men are prospecting. A concern for potable water constantly occupies the men's minds. Wright repeatedly dramatizes the difficulty of living in the area by retailing the problems the men have in finding fresh food to supplement their provisions. Comic qualities in Washoe Rambles appear sporadically. Wright's favorite theme for comic portrayal is drinking. He mildly pokes fun at his expedition's propensity to drink, but it is the stranger who wishes to bum a drink from them that occasions a full comic scene not once, but 3 times. In each case, Wright provides elaborate details to show how the bummers hog the flask or bottle. Dandy Quill's somewhat comic fall from his horse early in the series later becomes a funny tale told by one of the companions. But Dandy Quill does not achieve a full comic status in Wright's presentation, nor does the narrative outlook on events deliver a comic vision, underscoring Wright's paramount purpose to record actual events, not adulterate the account of comic fiction, a signature tactic in early travel letters by Clemens, whose Mark Twain persona at times does register as a vivid comic character than the story world of the embedded tales. The serious journalist approach that predominates in William Wright's Washoe Rambles can also be found in J.Ross Browne's travel writings about the Nevada Territory and the Silver Rush. Browne, whose book about travel in Europe and the Middle East, Yusuf, had been very popular years earlier, made the trek from San Francisco to Virginia City and wrote up his adventures for Harper's Monthly in a 3-part series entitled A Peep at Washoe, which resembles Washoe Rambles in the way that comic elements form a notable yet secondary stratum of the narrative. Nevertheless, Browne ultimately shows more comic adeptness when he chooses to use laughter-inducing strategies to tell his story than does Wright. The book Yusuf had also displayed a notable comic quality, in that case through the narrator's relationship to his Middle East guide, the rascally Yusuf. If you want to know more about this, Joe Cicilla has written on this book. Wright's Dandy Quill uses a cultured voice in Washoe Rambles, and Browne's persona and narrator in A Peep at Washoe, also named Yusuf, sounds cultured too. However cultured and well-spoken, Yusuf is not snobbish, but he remains fundamentally ambivalent about what he experiences. Structurally, the drama of Yusuf's adventure organizes A Peep at Washoe, adventures that include difficult late winter crossings of the divide, most of the distance on foot, the vicissitudes of trying to find comfortable lodgings and decent food, a bout of sickness, and the consequences of being robbed, not once, but twice. This adventurous quality marks an important difference from Wright's travel narrative, which in general presents more mundane events or relegates adventure to tales told by characters. Thematically, A Peep at Washoe adumbrates a warning, even a plea, against the lunacy of the Silver Rush, anticipating William Wright's own concern about the obsessive dream of striking it rich and the comments Mark Twain makes in Roughing It. As Browne's persona Yusuf proceeds on his journey to Virginia City, the narrative conveys an overwhelming irrationality, not only by the sheer volume of traffic he encounters, but also by its hectic and chaotic quality. The road from Placerville to Strawberry Flat, the first stage of the journey, remains nearly impassable in the melting snows, yet the exodus has not diminished. The result is a road, quote, literally lined with broken down stages, wagons, and carts, end quote. The absurd dimension of the human flood of departures for the Comstock can be best understood when Browne describes how it dams itself up temporarily each night in lodgings along the way. In Strawberry Flats, the place where he stops for the night, it has so many men in a 15 by 20 foot parlor, at least 40, that getting into the room meant walking on someone. The struggle for the shelter, so in the Airbnb you're in now is all right. The struggle for shelter, however, only intensifies once one reaches the Comstock district. In Silver City, many fortune seekers, quote, lived in holes dug into the side of the hill, and here and there a blanket thrown over a few stakes served as a domicile to shield them from the weather, end quote. In Virginia City, Browne notes frame shanties, tents made of canvas, blankets, brush, or potato sacks, mud hovels, and large coyote holes, pits and shafts used as homes. Even the Holiday Inn is better than that, right? The degrading horrors of Virginia City serve as the climactic imagery of the mad rush for silver. A fight is in progress as Yusuf enters the town, which is the image that's shown in the Symposium program from Harper's. The gallery of character types encountered Monte dealers, gamblers, and cutthroats, as well as a known murderer, the San Francisco speculator, the bummer, and the self-proclaimed Washoe millionaire, all prompt him to invoke Dante's descent into hell. And this is descending into hell too. I don't know what's happening.
Don't worry about it. I've got plenty of beer from dinner last night.
Okay. Okay, after all, the descent into hell. After all, the road to Virginia City passes through a locale called the Devil's Gate. Browne reports the frightening ease with which men could become ill in Virginia City due to exposure, dissipation, and the deleterious quality of the water. He too had succumbed to the bad water, which put him into serious danger. Quote, when a poor fellow fell sick, his recovery... when a poor fellow fell sick, his recovery could only be regarded as a matter of luck. No record of deaths was kept. The mass of the immigration were strangers to each other, and it concerned nobody in particular when a man pegged out, except to put him in a hole somewhere out of the way. End quote. For those lucky enough to remain above ground, the enterprise of mining could easily become enterprise of another sort. The simplest of landlords who own even the meanest of lodgings intensify such insight about the market law of supply and demand. Their habit of stuffing their rooms with as many men as possible and charging as much as possible earns them this compliment from Yusuf, delivered in phrasing that anticipates the sarcastic side of Mark Twain. Quote, it was much in favor of our landlord that he charges only double the customary rate. I would cheerfully give him a recommendation if only he would wash his face and plates once or twice a week. A peep at Washoe as travel writing presents deft first-person reporting augmented with narrative devices typical of story paper tales. The power of the narrative, therefore, comes not from a journalistic rendition of actual events, but from a deliberate effort to mimic the popular tales in the story papers. Exotic events and details that intrigue and even shock a reader, packaged with a moralizing attitude and an apparent triumph of good over evil. The formula was perfect for literally hundreds of blood and thunder style tales in these story papers. A peep at Washoe suggests how useful the formula could be to organize events into a set of travel letters. Clemens uses the same formula to structure some of his Hawaii correspondence. This formula makes A Peep at Washoe a livelier and more dramatic read than Washoe Rambles. If Clemens' letters from Hawaii resembles Browne's A Peep at Washoe in that both are instances of how travel writing can be effectively dramatized as though the narrative were fiction, Browne also portends Clemens in his willingness to use comic strategies. Unlike Sam Clemens, however, J.Ross Browne does not create a character whose humor includes a large measure of self-deprecation, a major difference from early Mark Twain. Instead, the comic scenes on which Browne lavishes details involve other figures. For example, Yusuf's original common man traveling companion, the Yankee speculator. Though Yusuf as narrative voice never becomes a comic character in the way that Mark Twain does in his early travel narratives, Browne does employ a comic technique familiar to Mark Twain, utilizing the conventions of yarning to embroider Yusuf's personality. There are many comic examples in A Peep at Washoe, but I do not have time to indulge, but here's one to close. In the third installment of the travel letters, Yusuf as rascal narrator and yarn spinner tips his hand that he was in fact complicit with the questionably moral ethos of the mining camp when he returned to Carson City from Virginia City ill and destitute. There he remembers that he had advertised his services as an agent to all and sundry, telling them to direct inquiries to Carson City. His responses to their letters occupy 2 full columns of Harper's and provide some of the most hilarious reading in the travel letters. Here is one response. So the inquiry says, I have about 20 head of American cows and I would like to sell them and I wish a contract made in advance. Browne's answer, could find nobody who wanted to pay cash for cows. Money is scarce, cows are plenty. I've sold your cows, however, for the following valuable claims. 25 feet in the root hog or die, 40 feet in the let her rip, 50 feet in the gone case, and 100 feet in you bet. Charge $25, which please remit by express. Providing such flippant responses to his would-be clients anticipates what Mark Twain will do in his erstwhile column for the Californian in 1865, Answers to Correspondents. Browne's ability to score satiric points against a variety of targets also anticipates Clemens, inviting laughter at the habits of miners, at the way that mining has usurped all other activities, at the inherent riskiness of all business enterprise in Washoe, and at the way that swindles can easily be propagated to engulf everyone, even the narrator with whom the reader would ordinarily identify as the moral center of the story. Though J.Ross Browne and A Peep at Washoe may anticipate Sam Clemens in his use of some comic techniques, and though both writers, along with William Wright, share the fundamentally journalistic impulse of travel writing, neither Browne nor Wright are inclined to attempt the kind of prose pictures that Clemens exhibits at particular moments in the letters from Hawaii. The more literary style description that Mark Twain used to describe Honolulu, the Kalihi Valley, or the volcano Kilauea are not much in evidence in either Peep Washoe or Washoe Rambles. Ultimately, the great difference among these travel letters is the comprehensive way that Clemens insinuated an already forceful comic alter ego into his own narratives of travel. Whatever points of contact Wright and Browne share with Clemens in their travel letters, only Clemens decided to allow a comic narrator and character to dominate the narrative, a feature clearly on display at times in his retrospective of time spent on the West Coast and in the Hawaiian Islands, roughing it. Thank you for listening.